What will happen to Donald Trump if Denmark demands NATO action over Greenland spies? Donald Trump's political nightmare just took a shocking international turn. Reports now reveal that Denmark has caught Trump-linked operatives running espionage missions in Greenland, reigniting suspicions about his long-standing obsession with seizing the territory. This isn't just a quirky throwback to Trump's bizarre Buy Greenland idea. It's a full-blown diplomatic crisis that threatens America's credibility with its NATO allies. If Denmark pushes NATO to act, Trump could face not only global humiliation, but also questions about whether his actions amount to betraying U.S. alliances for personal gain. Could this spark a fracture inside NATO itself, or even bring calls for sanctions? Stay tuned as we break it down right now. Donald Trump's presidency and post-presidency have been defined by controversy, but the allegations emerging from Denmark strike at the heart of America's credibility within NATO. According to reports, Denmark has summoned the top United States envoy after uncovering covert operations in Greenland. These operations, allegedly linked to Trump and his circle, are described as espionage against a NATO ally with the goal of preparing a plan to seize Greenland. For years, Trump has openly fantasized about purchasing Greenland, even suggesting that it should become part of the United States. While those comments were initially dismissed as bluster, the suggestion of actual intelligence operations directed against Denmark is profoundly different. If confirmed, such activity could put the United States in direct violation of NATO's founding principles and even open the door to the invocation of Article 5 against America itself. The implications are enormous, ranging from diplomatic humiliation to strategic rupture across the Atlantic Alliance. This analysis will explore what would happen if Denmark demands NATO action over these espionage operations. We will examine the historical context of Greenland's status, the legal and political mechanisms within NATO, Trump's ongoing relationship with Russia, the economic and domestic backdrop in the United States, and the broader consequences for America's role as leader of the Western Alliance. What emerges is a picture of extraordinary potential fallout, one that underscores the fragility of international order when great powers are steered by impulsive and self-serving leadership. To understand the stakes, one must first appreciate Greenland's unique role in global strategy. Greenland is not just a vast icy landmass, it is a critical geopolitical asset. Located in the Arctic, it serves as a northern gateway between North America and Europe, hosting key air bases and offering potential for natural resource exploitation. During the Cold War, American military planners recognized Greenland as an indispensable site for monitoring Soviet missile activity and maintaining control of transatlantic air routes. Today, as the Arctic becomes a new frontier of great power competition, Greenland's significance is even greater. Greenland is not an independent state. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. While it exercises home rule in many areas, foreign affairs and defense remain firmly under Copenhagen's authority. Any attempt by an outside power to coerce or undermine Danish sovereignty in Greenland is therefore an attack on Denmark itself. By extension, under NATO's founding charter, it is an attack on the entire alliance. Article 5 of the NATO treaty states that an armed attack against one ally shall be considered an attack against all. While espionage does not necessarily equal an armed attack, Denmark could argue that the preparation of covert operations aimed at territorial takeover is a direct threat to its sovereignty and security. This argument, if pursued, would place NATO in uncharted waters. Never before has the alliance had to consider action against one of its own members. But then again, never before has one of its members been accused of planning to seize the territory of another ally. The Danish government's reaction has already been unusually sharp. By summoning the American envoy, Copenhagen has signaled that it views the matter with the utmost seriousness. Denmark is a small country, but it has always been a loyal NATO partner, contributing troops to missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other theaters. For Denmark to accuse Washington of covert aggression is not only unprecedented, but also deeply damaging to the perception of American reliability. This is not a matter of policy disagreement, such as trade disputes or burden-sharing arguments. It is a charge of betrayal within the alliance itself. If Denmark presses the issue within NATO, it will create an immediate diplomatic crisis. European members of NATO, already distrustful of Trump due to his admiration for Vladimir Putin and his repeated attacks on allies, may line up behind Denmark. Countries like Germany and France, long wary of Trump's transactional approach to alliances, could use this as an opportunity to isolate him diplomatically. The United Kingdom, traditionally America's closest partner, would be placed in an impossible position, caught between solidarity with a fellow NATO member and its historic ties to Washington. Smaller allies, from the Baltic states to southern Europe, would have to calculate whether siding with Trump would risk their own credibility within the alliance. In short, Denmark's move could force the rest of NATO to choose between Trump and the integrity of the alliance's founding principles. The most explosive scenario would be if Denmark attempted to invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty. As mentioned earlier, Article 5 has only been triggered once in NATO history, after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. That invocation led to joint military action in Afghanistan and demonstrated the alliance's unity in the face of aggression. The idea of Article 5 being invoked against the United States is almost unthinkable, but the treaty does not exclude that possibility. Article 5 simply states that an attack on one member shall be considered an attack on all. If Denmark presents evidence that Trump directed espionage operations to prepare a plan of forcible seizure of Greenland, then it could argue that this constitutes aggression. Most likely, NATO would avoid a direct confrontation by invoking Article 4 instead. Article 4 allows for consultation among allies when the security or territorial integrity of a member is threatened. This mechanism has been used several times, for instance by Turkey and the Baltic states, to raise concerns about Russia. Denmark could use Article 4 to force NATO into a formal consultation, placing the issue squarely on the alliance's agenda. That alone would be devastating for the United States, since it would mean that the alliance is officially treating Washington as a potential aggressor. Even without Article 5, the diplomatic cost to Trump would be severe. America's leadership within NATO would be shattered, and the credibility of the alliance as a unified body would be in jeopardy. The espionage allegations cannot be examined in isolation from Trump's broader foreign policy posture. As reports emphasize, Trump has simultaneously been cozying up to Vladimir Putin, exploring increased trade with Russia, including in sensitive sectors such as diamonds and energy. ExxonMobil, a company long linked with American-Russian energy ventures, is reportedly pursuing deals with Moscow under Trump's watch. This pattern fits a long-standing narrative. Trump consistently undermines America's democratic allies while cultivating ties with authoritarian regimes. From the perspective of European leaders, this behavior raises the alarming possibility that espionage in Greenland is not just about Trump's personal obsession with territory, but also about weakening NATO itself in ways that benefit Russia. If Greenland were destabilized, or if NATO unity were broken, the strategic winner would be Moscow. For Denmark and other European states, this is not an abstract concern, but a matter of national security. One of the most disturbing aspects of this situation is the contrast between the gravity of the allegations and Trump's own public communications. As Denmark reacts to espionage and as NATO's credibility hangs in the balance, Trump's public statements focus on mocking late-night television hosts and complaining about perceived slights in the media. His posts about Seth Meyers, for example, reveal a leader consumed by petty grievances rather than national security crises. This behavior underscores a broader truth about Trump's political style. He thrives on personal vendettas and cultural conflicts while neglecting the responsibilities of statesmanship. For allies abroad, this makes him not just untrustworthy, but dangerously unreliable. If the United States under Trump cannot even acknowledge the seriousness of espionage against a NATO ally, then what confidence can those allies have in Washington's commitments to collective defense? While Trump grapples with international humiliation, the domestic environment in the United States adds layers of vulnerability. The American economy, already fragile, is showing signs of stress. Reports indicate over 800,000 layoffs in 2025 alone, with consumer credit applications being denied at historically high levels. Nearly half of Americans seeking credit have been turned away, and student loan defaults are surging. Inflation, which Trump's allies have downplayed, continues to reemerge, driven by both global market instability and reckless domestic policy. Trump's attempts to gain control over the Federal Reserve are seen by economists as a dangerous power grab, one that would politicize monetary policy and undermine institutional independence. Comparisons to Turkey, Argentina, and Zimbabwe highlight the risks of authoritarian meddling in central banking, where inflation and financial chaos followed efforts to subjugate economic policy to political ambition. In this context, Denmark's confrontation with the United States does not occur in a vacuum. International partners are aware of America's internal weaknesses, and adversaries see opportunities. A United States distracted by economic turmoil and led by a president focused on personal gain rather than institutional stability is less able to project power abroad. For Denmark and other European states, this means that the risk of espionage in Greenland must be considered not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern, a declining America under Trump, one that poses threats both to itself and to its allies. Domestically, Trump's approval ratings continue to decline. Even in traditionally Republican districts, Democrats are outperforming expectations. The loss in Iowa's Senate District 1, where Trump previously enjoyed an 11.5-point advantage, illustrates the erosion of his political base. Americans are growing weary of rising costs, stagnant wages, and a sense of insecurity. When a president is losing credibility at home, allies abroad become less forgiving. They calculate that he may not be able to deliver on promises or maintain commitments. In this way, Denmark's decision to push back on espionage is reinforced by the knowledge that Trump is politically weakened at home. They know they are not confronting a popular or stable leader, but rather one on the defensive. If Denmark pushes NATO to act, the alliance faces a dilemma with existential consequences. NATO has always been based on trust among its members. Even when there have been disputes over burden sharing or policy direction, the assumption has been that no member would deliberately undermine another. Espionage against an ally with the intent of territorial seizure violates that assumption at the deepest level. If NATO chooses to ignore Denmark's concerns, it signals that the alliance is hollow, that smaller members cannot rely on protection if the aggressor is powerful. That would embolden not only Trump, but also adversaries like Russia and China, who would see an opportunity to exploit divisions. On the other hand, if NATO formally censures the United States, invokes Article 4, or even considers the extraordinary step of suspending Washington's participation, the alliance enters uncharted territory. How does NATO function without its largest military power? Could it survive as a European-led coalition? These are questions that would have seemed unthinkable a decade ago, but Trump's behavior has made them urgent. European leaders are already considering greater autonomy through initiatives like the European Union's defense cooperation mechanisms. A rupture over Greenland could accelerate that trend, leading to a parallel security structure in Europe less dependent on Washington. For the United States, this would mean the loss of strategic influence in Europe, a setback that no president has overseen since the end of World War. The global order would not remain unaffected. China would seize the opportunity to deepen ties with Europe, presenting itself as a more reliable economic partner, even if not a security ally. Russia would benefit directly, seeing NATO's cohesion weaken. For countries in regions like the Middle East and Asia, the perception of American unreliability would grow. The ripple effects of Denmark's push could therefore extend far beyond the Arctic, reshaping alliances around the globe. America's adversaries have long hoped for such a moment, when Western unity falters not because of external pressure, but because of self-inflicted wounds. If Trump's espionage against Denmark leads to NATO rupture, it would mark a turning point in the decline of U.S. hegemony. One important question is whether American institutions would act to constrain Trump if Denmark demanded NATO action. The U.S. Congress, even under partisan pressure, still retains constitutional oversight of foreign policy. If evidence of espionage against Denmark is presented, hearings could be convened, subpoenas issued, and investigations launched. Members of Congress from both parties would be forced to take a position. Do they defend Trump at the expense of America's alliances, or do they draw a line to preserve U.S. credibility abroad? For Republicans, this would be a painful dilemma. Loyalty to Trump has become a defining feature of the party, but betraying NATO could alienate defense hawks and undermine Republican claims to be the party of national security. The Pentagon would also play a role. U.S. military leaders are deeply tied to NATO through decades of cooperation. They understand that the alliance is not just symbolic, but central to America's ability to project power globally. If Trump attempted to escalate conflict with Denmark or dismiss NATO's concerns, the military establishment might resist or seek ways to reassure allies. This could manifest in quiet diplomacy, public statements, or even direct defiance of presidential directives if they are deemed unlawful. Such a confrontation between Trump and his own military would further destabilize the United States, creating a constitutional crisis layered atop an international one. The judiciary could also become involved. If espionage operations were conducted in violation of U.S. law, courts might hear cases brought by whistleblowers or advocacy groups. This would prolong the crisis and keep it in the headlines. For Denmark, the knowledge that Trump does not control all levers of American power could provide some reassurance. They may calculate that pressing the issue will strengthen the hand of U.S. institutions against an erratic president. But the risk remains that Trump, determined to consolidate power, would lash out at both domestic critics and international allies. In that case, the crisis could spiral beyond the control of any single branch of government. The long-term consequences of Denmark demanding NATO action are profound. For Trump personally, the humiliation would be historic. He has long presented himself as a master negotiator, a leader who commands respect on the global stage. Being exposed as an aggressor against a NATO ally would demolish that image. It would not only damage his political viability at home, but also mark him in history as the president who shattered the Atlantic Alliance. For a man obsessed with legacy and reputation, this would be a devastating blow. For NATO, the challenge is equally significant. If the alliance survives this crisis, it may do so in a weakened form. Trust among allies will be harder to rebuild. Smaller members may never again feel fully secure under the American umbrella. If the alliance fractures, Europe will be forced to accelerate its own defense initiatives, creating a world with multiple overlapping security blocks. This would complicate global diplomacy, weaken deterrence against adversaries, and increase the risk of conflict. In the Arctic specifically, where competition over resources and shipping routes is intensifying, a weakened NATO would invite Russian and Chinese assertiveness. Greenland, rather than becoming a symbol of American expansion, could become the front line of a new great power struggle. The United States would pay a lasting price. Its moral authority, already diminished by years of Trump's disregard for democratic norms, would be further eroded. Future presidents, even if committed to rebuilding alliances, would face skepticism. Allies would wonder whether America could be trusted over the long term, given the possibility of another Trump-like figure rising to power. This skepticism would translate into hedging behavior, where allies seek alternative security arrangements and diversify their economic and diplomatic ties. The era of unchallenged American leadership, already under strain, would draw closer to its end. The allegations of espionage in Greenland strike at the heart of the transatlantic alliance. If Denmark demands NATO action, the consequences for Donald Trump and the United States would be catastrophic. At best, America would suffer unprecedented diplomatic humiliation, with NATO formally consulting over U.S. aggression. At worst, the alliance could fracture, with Article 5 turned against the very country that created NATO in the first place. For Trump, this would mean the collapse of his claims to strength and respect abroad. For the United States, it would mark a new low in its global standing, one from which recovery would be uncertain and incomplete. The world would witness the unraveling of the very alliance that safeguarded peace for 75 years, not at the hands of external adversaries, but from the reckless ambition of a leader who placed personal obsession above national and international security.